Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the story of a man whose name still echoes through history, Christopher Columbus. He was a sailor who dreamed beyond the horizon, who set out across an ocean when most people feared the unknown, and who reached lands that would change the world forever. In this series we will slowly unfold his life, his struggles, his voyages, and the mark he left on history. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. So let's begin, gently, with the world into which Columbus was born. Christopher Columbus came into the world in the year 1451 in the bustling port city of Genoa, on the northwestern coast of Italy. Genoa at the time was not a quiet place. It was a city alive with trade, sailors, and the constant hum of ships being loaded and unloaded. The salty air of the harbour carried the scent of spices from the east, the richness of cloth from Flanders, and the exotic goods that passed through Mediterranean markets. From his earliest days, Columbus would have heard the creak of masts, the shouts of merchants, and the crash of waves against the stone docks. Genoa was a republic built on the sea, a place where boys could not grow up without being influenced by tales of voyages, storms, and faraway lands. Columbus's family was not noble, and he was not born into wealth. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver, working with fabrics and dyes in a modest shop. His mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, cared for the household and her children. The family was hard-working, but their life was ordinary compared to the splendour of wealthy merchants or powerful ship owners. Still, in a city like Genoa, even a boy from a modest family could dream. As a child, Columbus likely received only a simple education. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught. But what mattered most in a seafaring city was learning skills that could bring food to the table. Yet from an early age he showed a curiosity that reached beyond daily survival. The Mediterranean world of his childhood was filled with stories. Sailors brought news of Constantinople, which had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, just 2 years after Columbus's birth. This event shook Europe, for it marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and cut off Christian access to eastern trade routes. Tales of spices, silks, and gold, now harder to reach, stirred imaginations across Europe. It was a time when the world seemed to be changing quickly, when old maps were becoming outdated, and when the hunger for discovery was awakening. Columbus grew up with this backdrop of shifting trade and restless ambition. As he entered his teenage years, he began to work alongside his father, helping in the weaving trade. But the call of the sea was never far away. Young Christopher listened to sailors who returned from voyages to the far corners of the Mediterranean. He heard of storms off the coast of Africa, of pirates who lurked along trade routes, and of islands where riches could be found. These stories were as much a part of his education as the lessons he received in school. At some point in his youth, Columbus began to sail himself. The exact details are uncertain, but records suggest he went on voyages along the coasts of Italy, perhaps even to faraway lands such as Greece or Portugal. The sea taught him lessons that no classroom could provide: how to read the wind, how to steer through storms, how to trust the stars when the land disappeared from view. These early experiences were shaping him into more than just a dreamer. They were shaping him into a sailor. Genoa, meanwhile, was a city always in competition, not only with its neighbours but with faraway powers like Venice. The rivalry between Genoa and Venice over control of Mediterranean trade routes was fierce. Battles were fought at sea, alliances were made and broken, and fortunes rose and fell with the tides. To grow up in Genoa was to grow up in a world where the sea was both opportunity and danger. For Columbus, this world was the foundation of his destiny. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already seen more of the sea than many men would in their lifetimes. He had learned to respect its power, but also to feel its pull, and somewhere deep inside him, a vision was forming. He would not remain a simple sailor content with coastal journeys. His thoughts were turning westward, toward horizons that few dared to imagine. As Columbus moved further into adulthood, the sea became not just a curiosity but the centre of his existence. Genoa offered him the perfect training ground, with countless ships sailing in and out of its harbours. By the time he was in his late teens, he had already begun to work on voyages that took him beyond the Italian coasts. The Mediterranean was a busy crossroads, where merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims moved constantly between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Sailing there was never peaceful. Storms could arise suddenly, and pirates often lay in wait. Columbus, however, seemed drawn to these challenges. He was eager to learn not only the skills of navigation, but also the stories of distant lands, which fueled his imagination even further. In 1476, when he was about 25 years old, Columbus joined a convoy of ships bound for England. Along the way, they encountered a naval battle off the coast of Portugal. The fight left his ship badly damaged, and Columbus was forced to swim to shore to save his life. He reached the coast near Lisbon, exhausted but alive, and this moment marked a turning point. From then on, Portugal would become his home for many years, and it was here that his greatest ideas began to take shape. Lisbon was unlike Genoa. While Genoa looked toward the Mediterranean, Portugal faced the Atlantic Ocean, and its sailors were among the boldest in Europe. The Portuguese had already begun exploring down the west coast of Africa, searching for new trade routes and riches. Prince Henry the Navigator, who had died in 1460, had inspired a generation of explorers to push further and further south, mapping lands and building knowledge of winds and currents. Columbus arrived in Lisbon at a time when the spirit of discovery was strong. The streets of the city echoed with talk of voyages to Africa, of gold and ivory, and of strange islands glimpsed in the distance. For a man who had always dreamed of going beyond known waters, this was the perfect place to be. In Portugal, Columbus married Filipa Moniz Perestrello, the daughter of a noble family with ties to Madeira, an island off the coast of Africa. Through this marriage, Columbus gained access to valuable charts, notes, and knowledge left behind by his father-in-law, who had served as governor of Madeira. These documents spoke of winds, routes, and possibilities that stretched into the Atlantic. For Columbus, they were treasures of a different kind, feeding his growing obsession with the idea of sailing westward. He began to study not only the Portuguese records but also the works of classical scholars. Ancient writers like Ptolemy, as well as more recent ones like Marco Polo, influenced his thoughts. He read about lands described far to the east, and he began to wonder, what if one could reach them by going west, across the Atlantic, instead of around Africa? At this time, the full size of the Earth was not well understood. Many people believed Asia was much closer to Europe than it truly was. Columbus, relying on some flawed calculations, became convinced that the distance across the Atlantic was not as great as most feared. His mind began to settle firmly on the idea that a westward voyage could be possible, even practical. This vision was bold, and to many it seemed foolish, but Columbus was not easily discouraged. He continued to sail with Portuguese expeditions, travelling as far as Iceland in the north, and possibly along the coast of Africa in the south. Each voyage gave him more confidence and skill, and each return to Lisbon gave him more time to refine his plan. The dream of crossing the Atlantic was no longer just a fantasy. It was becoming a mission. Columbus spent the late 1470s and early 1480s absorbing every scrap of information he could about the seas and lands beyond Europe. In Lisbon, sailors returning from Africa spoke of strange currents, shifting winds, and coastlines filled with both danger and wealth. Maps, often incomplete and filled with guesses, circulated among navigators and scholars, and Columbus studied them carefully. He was fascinated by the Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Azores, and the Canary Islands, which seemed like stepping stones into the unknown. If such islands existed far from the European mainland, why could there not be others even farther west? The idea began to grow stronger in his mind. What if Asia lay just beyond a manageable stretch of water? He believed this distance was not as vast as most assumed, though in truth his calculations were dangerously optimistic. During this period, Columbus often sailed with Portuguese expeditions. He may have reached as far as the Gold Coast of Africa, gaining first-hand knowledge of a long-distance navigation and trade. He observed how winds and currents shaped every journey. The trade winds pushed ships southwest, while the return currents guided them back toward Europe. These natural forces were not obstacles but patterns to be mastered, and Columbus paid close attention. He began to see the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a pathway. In 1480, tragedy struck when Felipa, his wife, died, leaving Columbus with their young son Diego. Despite his grief, he did not abandon his vision. He moved to Spain in the mid-1480s, seeking support from the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. Spain, unlike Portugal, was not yet fully engaged in exploration, for the kingdom was still focused on completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to drive Muslim forces from the Iberian Peninsula. But Columbus believed Spain held the key to his dream. When he first presented his plan, Spanish advisors rejected it. They said the distance across the Atlantic was far greater than he claimed, and they feared such a voyage was doomed to failure. Still, Columbus refused to give up. He lived modestly, often supported by friends and benefactors, and he continued to refine his arguments. He appealed to religious ideals, suggesting that a new route to Asia would help spread Christianity. He appealed to economic hopes, promising wealth and new trade opportunities. And he appealed to ambition, offering Ferdinand and Isabella a chance to surpass their Portuguese rivals. Years passed, and still he waited. Yet during this time of uncertainty, Columbus also found encouragement. Some scholars and navigators agreed with him, and some even whispered of lands sighted far to the west by sailors blown off course. These hints gave him hope. Though many doors were closed, Columbus pressed on, convinced that persistence would eventually bring him the chance he sought. By the late 1480s, Columbus's determination had hardened into something close to obsession. He no longer saw his westward plan as just an idea, but as a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. Living in Spain, he began to build connections that would eventually bring him closer to the royal court. He sought out influential clerics, scholars, and courtiers who might listen to his proposals and speak on his behalf. One such figure was the friar Juan Perez, a former confessor to Queen Isabella. Perez became convinced of Columbus's sincerity and helped arrange introductions at court. Still, it was not easy. Many advisors ridiculed Columbus, pointing to the vastness of the Atlantic and the uncertainty of what lay beyond. Yet Columbus had a quality that set him apart: patience combined with relentless belief. He was willing to wait years if necessary, always refining his arguments, always pushing forward. At the same time, he supported himself through chart-making and occasional voyages, never losing touch with the sea that inspired him. Spain itself was undergoing dramatic change. Ferdinand and Isabella were nearing the end of the Reconquista. In 1492, their forces captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia. With this triumph, the monarchs could now turn their eyes outward, toward expansion and influence beyond Europe. The timing, though Columbus could not have known it at first, would prove decisive. While he waited for an official decision, Columbus travelled within Spain, living for a time in Seville, then moving to monasteries and small towns where he found sympathy. His persistence became a story in itself. Though rejected multiple times, he always returned, asking for another hearing, another chance to present his calculations. His sons, Diego and the younger Ferdinand, were constant reminders of his responsibility, yet also of the legacy he dreamed of leaving behind. In these years, Columbus was not only a sailor but also a man of faith. He often wrote about his belief that God had chosen him for this mission, that he was meant to open a path across the ocean for both commerce and Christianity. This conviction gave him strength when logic and reason seemed stacked against him. By 1491, his situation grew desperate. He had spent nearly a decade in Spain without success, and there were moments when he considered taking his idea elsewhere, perhaps to France or even back to Portugal. Yet fate kept him in Spain, where his persistence would finally be rewarded. For as the Reconquista ended, the Spanish monarchs were ready to embrace bold new ventures. Advisors remained cautious, but Isabella's interest in expanding Spain's reach, combined with Ferdinand's ambition to compete with Portugal, created the opening Columbus had long awaited. The stage was set for his dream to move from words and petitions to ships and sails. In January of 1492, Columbus once again stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, hoping that this time would be different. At first, it was not. Their council of advisors dismissed his plan yet again, calling it unrealistic and risky. Columbus left disheartened, convinced he had reached the end of his efforts in Spain. But fortune turned quickly. Just months later, Granada fell, and with victory came new confidence. The monarchs now had resources to spare and a desire to project Spain's power onto the world stage. Friends at court, including Juan Perez and Luis de Santangel, the treasurer of Aragon, urged Isabella to reconsider Columbus's proposal. They argued that the potential rewards outweighed the risks, and that Spain could not allow Portugal to dominate exploration unchallenged. Finally, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed. In April 1492, they signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus the authority to sail westward in search of new lands and routes. The agreement was generous. Columbus would be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, given noble titles, and promised a share of the profits from whatever he discovered. For a man of humble birth, these honours were extraordinary, and they confirmed his belief that destiny was guiding him. With royal support secured, Columbus turned his attention to the practical task of preparing a fleet. 3 ships were chosen: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Niña and the Pinta were caravels, smaller, lighter vessels suited for exploration, while the Santa Maria was a larger carrack, sturdy but slower. The crews were recruited from Palos, a port town in Andalusia, and many were hesitant at first. Rumours of sea monsters, endless waters, and falling off the edge of the world still lingered in the minds of common sailors, but promises of pay, pardon for past crimes, and the lure of adventure eventually filled the rosters. Columbus himself projected confidence, speaking not of doubts, but of certainty. He truly believed Asia lay just across the Atlantic, and he carried himself with an authority that inspired at least enough trust to set the plan in motion. During these months of preparation, Columbus also thought often of his sons. Diego, his elder child, was placed under care in Spain, while his younger son, Ferdinand, would later become a companion and chronicler of his adventures. The weight of family responsibility mingled with the thrill of opportunity, giving Columbus both motivation and urgency. By summer the ships were ready. Supplies of food, water and equipment were loaded, though by modern standards they were meagre. Faith, courage and determination would have to carry the men through what lay ahead. On August 3rd, 1492, under a hot Spanish sun, Columbus and his crew set sail from Palos. The moment marked the beginning of one of history's most famous voyages, a leap into waters few Europeans had dared to cross. The horizon stretched wide before them, filled with both promise and uncertainty, as the little fleet began its westward journey into the unknown. The 3 ships moved slowly at first, hugging the coast of Spain before striking farther into open water. The men on board adjusted to life at sea, a routine that demanded discipline and patience. Days began with the rising sun, when sailors hauled ropes, trimmed sails and checked the rigging. Meals were simple: hardtack biscuits, dried beans, salted meat and wine to wash it down. Fresh food would not last long, and water grew stale quickly. Life was harsh, and the cramped space offered little comfort. Yet Columbus held the crew together with a mix of authority and inspiration. He spoke often of the riches and glory awaiting them, of the certainty that Asia lay just beyond the horizon. To the men he appeared steady, even when they felt doubts. His confidence became a shield against fear. By the time they reached the Canary Islands, one of Spain's last outposts in the Atlantic, repairs and adjustments were needed. The Pinta had suffered problems with her rudder, and Columbus used the stop to make necessary fixes. The islands also provided a chance to restock supplies and gather news. Local sailors spoke of strong winds farther west, steady currents, and storms that could test even the hardier ships. Columbus listened carefully. He knew every detail mattered for what lay ahead. From the Canaries, the fleet turned westward into the true unknown. Once the coastline faded, the men faced only water and sky. At first, the winds carried them steadily, and spirits remained high. Dolphins played near the ships, and seabirds circled, offering signs of life even far from land. Yet as days turned to weeks, doubts grew. The ocean seemed endless, stretching without change. Whispers of turning back began to circulate. Columbus, however, had anticipated such fears. He kept 2 sets of records, one accurate, which showed the true distance travelled, and one shortened, which he shared with the crew to reassure them that progress was less daunting than it seemed. This small deception helped maintain order. At night, the sailors gazed at stars unfamiliar in their patterns, and Columbus guided them using both celestial charts and instinct born of years at sea. Each sunrise brought the same horizon, but he never wavered. He encouraged the men to believe that land was near, speaking of signs in the sky and the feel of currents beneath the ships. His persistence steadied them, though unease never fully disappeared. Weeks passed, and small clues began to stir hope. A branch with fresh leaves drifted by. A piece of carved wood floated near the ships. Birds not known to fly far from land appeared overhead. Each sign was seized upon as proof that their journey had meaning, that their destination was real. Columbus pointed to these omens with calm assurance, and the crew, though weary, pressed forward. The Atlantic, vast and silent, was slowly giving way to promise. By early October, the fleet had been at sea for more than 2 months. The endless waves tested the patience of even the most loyal sailors. Murmurs of mutiny grew louder with each passing day, and Columbus could feel the tension rising. Some men accused him of leading them into certain death, while others whispered about forcing a return to Spain. Still, Columbus remained calm. He reminded them of the promises of wealth, of the honour that awaited them if they succeeded, and of the disgrace if they turned back with nothing to show. He also appealed to their faith, suggesting that God himself guided their journey westward. His words carried weight, and though resentment lingered, the men obeyed. On October 7th, a shift occurred. Flocks of birds flew overhead, moving west and southwest, as though pointing the way to land. Columbus, seizing the moment, altered the course of the fleet to follow them. The change restored some hope, though doubts remained. Days later, more signs appeared. Pieces of reed, a stick carved by human hands, and fresh vegetation drifting on the waves. Excitement spread across the decks. Every sailor watched the horizon with new intensity, praying for the first glimpse of land. On the evening of October 11th, Columbus promised his crew that land would be sighted within the next day. He instructed them to keep careful watch, offering a reward of gold to the first man who spotted it. That night, tension filled the air. The moonlit ocean shimmered with anticipation, and sailors strained their eyes into the darkness. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana, a lookout on the Pinta, cried out that he had seen land. A dark shape rose from the horizon, and as dawn broke, it became clear. They had reached shores unknown to them. The men erupted with shouts of joy and relief. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, they had found what they sought. Columbus, deeply moved, fell to his knees in prayer, thanking God for delivering them safely. The fleet approached cautiously, dropping anchor off a lush island covered in green. Its shores shimmered in the morning light, and the sound of waves breaking on the beach carried the sweet promise of discovery. To Columbus, this was the edge of Asia, the gateway to the riches of the East. In reality, it was an island in the Bahamas, part of a world unknown to Europeans. Yet in that moment, No one doubted the greatness of what had been achieved. The long gamble of sailing west had led them to land, and history itself shifted with the sight of that distant shore. The morning of October 12, 1492, marked a moment that would echo for centuries. Columbus and his men lowered boats and rowed toward the island they had sighted. The sand was white, the waters shallow and crystal clear, and the vegetation unlike anything they had seen in Europe. Columbus carried with him the royal banner of Spain and a small cross. When he set foot on the beach, he claimed the island in the names of Ferdinand and Isabella, giving thanks with a solemn prayer. He called the land San Salvador, believing it to be one of the islands off the coast of Asia. To him, the journey's purpose had been fulfilled. The men followed, overwhelmed with relief. Some kissed the ground, others raised their arms to the sky. Weeks of fear, hunger, and doubt dissolved into joy. They had crossed the Atlantic and found land. Yet as they began to explore, it became clear this was no known coast of Asia. Palm trees swayed in the breeze, colourful birds filled the skies, and the warm air smelled of blossoms unlike any in Europe. The island seemed like a paradise, abundant and inviting. Soon they encountered the people who lived there. The inhabitants, later identified as Taino, approached with curiosity rather than fear. They brought food, water, and small gifts, welcoming the strangers with gestures of peace. Columbus noted their friendliness and generosity, describing them as open-hearted and gentle. He also observed their ornaments of gold, small pieces worn as jewellery, and this caught his attention more than anything else. To him, it was a sign that riches could be found in these lands. Over the next days, Columbus and his men sailed to nearby islands, each as lush and beautiful as the last. They marvelled at the fruits, the forests, and the abundance of resources. The sailors, once ready to mutiny, now felt proud to be part of a voyage that had proven the impossible. Columbus continued to believe he was near Asia, perhaps on islands close to Japan or China. His maps and calculations, though flawed, guided him in this conviction. The names he gave the islands reflected this belief, and he wrote in his journal with confidence that he had reached the Indies. The Taino, meanwhile, offered food and guidance, often joining the sailors in their explorations. Columbus took careful notes of their customs, their language, and their appearance. He imagined how easily they might accept Christianity, and he wrote to the monarchs of Spain about their potential as allies and subjects. For the sailors, the discovery of land ended their greatest fear, that the ocean had no end. Now they felt part of something larger than themselves, part of a story that would be told across Europe. The small fleet had crossed into a new world, though none of them yet understood how vast or how different it truly was. In the weeks following the first landing, Columbus pressed onward with exploration, eager to uncover more of the islands and to gather evidence that would impress the monarchs of Spain. He and his men sailed from San Salvador to other islands, each one presenting new sights that astonished the Europeans. The lush forests, the unfamiliar animals, and the abundance of fresh water created an impression of untouched abundance. The sailors, once weary and doubtful, now marvelled at the wonders around them. Everywhere they went, they met the Taino people, who welcomed them with open gestures, offering food, parrots, and cotton thread. Columbus saw in these encounters both opportunity and promise. He described the Taino as people who would easily be converted to Christianity, noting their gentleness and willingness to share. At the same time, he focused on their ornaments of gold, worn casually as nose rings or bracelets. He asked eagerly where the precious metal came from, and the Taino pointed south, toward lands they called rich in gold. This fueled Columbus's determination to continue searching. He convinced himself that he was approaching the outskirts of Asia, perhaps even the realms described by Marco Polo, where great cities and wealth awaited. As the fleet moved on, Columbus maintained careful records in his journal. He wrote of the landscapes, the people, and the resources, framing each discovery as proof of the success of his voyage. He knew that back in Spain, skeptics still doubted the value of his mission, and he needed evidence to silence them. Every description was written with a sense of purpose, as though he were building a case for his achievement. Yet life among the islands was not without tension. The sailors sometimes misunderstood the generosity of the Taino, taking more than was offered or demanding what they wished. Though most encounters were peaceful, small frictions arose, reminding both sides of their differences. Columbus tried to keep order, knowing that conflict could ruin the fragile goodwill that made exploration possible. He also struggled with the challenges of leadership. Supplies were dwindling, repairs were constant, and the responsibility of commanding 3 ships weighed heavily. He projected confidence, but inside, he felt the strain of balancing hope with reality. Each new island brought discoveries, but not yet the wealth of gold and spices he had promised. Still, he pressed on, convinced that the true riches lay just ahead. The men followed, some out of loyalty, others because they had no choice, but all with the sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. They had crossed into a world no European had known, and each day added to the unfolding mystery. For Columbus, this was only the beginning. He believed he'd opened the door to Asia, and he was determined to push through it, no matter how far the path extended. As the days turned into weeks, Columbus guided his fleet deeper among the islands of the Caribbean, convinced with every sighting of land that he was approaching the fabled riches of Asia. Each island appeared more fertile and inviting than the last, with dense forests, sweet-smelling flowers, and streams of fresh water. The sailors, who had once feared the ocean's emptiness, now found themselves in a world overflowing with life. The Taino continued to greet them with kindness, offering food, ornaments, and guidance. But Columbus's eyes were fixed on one goal: gold. Whenever he saw even the smallest piece of it, he pressed for answers, and each time the islanders pointed farther away, suggesting that greater stores lay elsewhere. It was enough to keep his determination burning. On December 5th, 1492, Columbus reached the coast of a large island he named Hispaniola. To him, it seemed the most promising of all. The harbours were deep, the land fertile, and the local people friendly. The island appeared to hold all the elements for a Spanish foothold in this new world. Columbus immediately imagined settlements, trade, and the spread of Christianity. He also believed Hispaniola might be close to the mainland of Asia, which made it even more valuable in his mind. While exploring, disaster struck. On Christmas Eve, the flagship Santa Maria ran aground after striking a reef. Despite the crew's efforts, the ship could not be saved. The men unloaded what they could, but the vessel itself was lost. Columbus turned misfortune into opportunity. He decided to build a small fort from the remains of the Santa Maria, using its timbers to construct houses and defences. The settlement, named La Navidad, became the first European outpost in the Americas. A group of about 40 men volunteered to remain behind when Columbus prepared to return to Spain. They were tasked with gathering resources, searching for gold, and establishing relations with the local Taino. Though Columbus believed this arrangement would secure Spain's claim, it also planted the seeds of future conflict. With the Nina and Pinta ready, Columbus prepared for the voyage home. His mind raced with what he would report: fertile lands, generous people, and signs of riches. He carried samples of plants, birds, and ornaments as proof. Most importantly, he carried the certainty that he had achieved what many thought impossible: crossing the Atlantic to reach new lands. On January 16th, 1493, Columbus began the return journey. The voyage was not easy. Storms battered the small ships, and at one point he feared they would sink, losing everything. He wrote a detailed account of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and cast it into the sea in the hope that even if he perished, news of his voyage would reach Spain. Fortune, however, favoured him. After weeks of hardship, the battered ships finally sighted the Azores, then Portugal, and at last Spain itself. Columbus had returned, carrying news that would change the course of history. when Columbus finally reached Spain in March 1493, the news of his return spread quickly. Word travelled ahead of him, carried by letters and rumours, and soon people gathered in the ports and towns to hear of the extraordinary voyage. He arrived in Palos to great celebration, greeted not as a simple sailor, but as a man who had accomplished the impossible. For centuries, people had feared the Atlantic as a boundless and deadly sea, yet Columbus had crossed it and returned with stories of lush islands and friendly inhabitants. To the common people, it sounded like a miracle. Soon after his arrival, Columbus travelled to Barcelona to meet Ferdinand and Isabella. The royal court received him with honour, and he presented his findings with care. He described the islands, the people, the abundance of resources, and the possibilities for trade. He spoke of gold, cotton, and spices, of birds and plants unknown in Europe, and of people eager to embrace Christianity. The monarchs listened intently, impressed not only by the discoveries but also by the opportunity. Spain had just completed the Reconquista, uniting its strength, and now a new horizon opened before them. Columbus displayed parrots, ornaments, and several Taino individuals he had brought with him, all meant to demonstrate the truth of his accounts. He also showed charts and notes, emphasizing his role as navigator and leader. His calm but confident presentation captured the court's imagination. Ferdinand and Isabella rewarded him generously. They confirmed the titles promised in the capitulations of Santa Fe: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the lands he had discovered. For Columbus, a man of modest birth, these honours were beyond anything he could have dreamed in his youth. They elevated him among the nobility and ensured his place in Spain's future endeavours. Beyond the royal court, news spread throughout Europe. Scholars debated what Columbus had found. Some believed he had indeed reached Asia, as he claimed, while others suspected he had encountered unknown lands. Merchants imagined new trade routes, while explorers wondered what else might lie across the Atlantic. The printing press helped circulate his letters, and within months his name was known across the continent. To Columbus himself there was no doubt. He was convinced he had reached islands on the edge of Asia, perhaps near Japan or India. He promised the monarchs that with more voyages, greater riches and powerful allies could be secured. His confidence convinced them to act quickly. Plans for a second expedition were launched almost immediately. This time the voyage would not be 3 small ships, but a full fleet, meant not just for exploration, but for settlement and conquest. In the spring of 1493, Spain began assembling men, ships, and supplies. Columbus, now an admiral, was at the centre of it all, preparing to return across the ocean he had dared to cross, determined to expand the vision that had begun in Genoa decades earlier. The months following Columbus's triumphant return were filled with planning and anticipation. Unlike his first voyage, which had relied on small ships and uncertain promises, the second expedition would be grand, designed to secure Spain's claim to the new lands and to establish permanent settlements. In September 1493, a fleet of 17 ships gathered in Cadiz, carrying more than 1,200 men. They were not only sailors, but also soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and settlers. Supplies included livestock, seeds, tools, and weapons, reflecting Spain's intention to build colonies rather than conduct a single journey of discovery. Columbus, now Admiral of the Ocean Sea, commanded with authority, though the scale of the expedition was far greater than anything he had led before. The fleet set sail on September 25th, following a southern route across the Atlantic. This time, the voyage was swifter, guided by steady trade winds that carried the ships to the Caribbean in just over a month. Spirits were high, for the men expected riches, land, and opportunity. When land was sighted in early November, the islands dazzled them with their beauty: lush forests, brilliant birds, and clear waters. Columbus named each new island, claiming them for Spain. Among these discoveries were Dominica, Guadalupe, and Puerto Rico. The Taino they encountered continued to greet them with generosity. though the sheer size of the Spanish fleet now revealed a new reality. This was no longer exploration, it was colonization. By late November, Columbus steered the fleet back to Hispaniola, eager to reunite with the men he had left at La Navidad. Yet upon arrival, he was met with devastation. The fort lay in ruins, and none of the 40 men remained alive. Local conflicts and poor discipline had led to their deaths, a grim reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. Though shaken, Columbus pressed forward. He chose another site, richer in resources and with a better harbour, where he ordered the construction of a new settlement named La Isabela in honour of the Queen. It became the first formal European town in the Americas. Life in La Isabela was harsh from the beginning. Supplies spoiled quickly, the climate was difficult, and disease spread among the settlers. Tensions grew between Spaniards and Taino as demands for food and labour strained what had once been goodwill. Columbus struggled to maintain order, balancing the expectations of settlers, the resistance of locals, and the distant oversight of the crown. He explored further, sending expeditions into the interior of Hispaniola, where reports of gold excited both him and his men. Small amounts were found, enough to encourage dreams but not enough to satisfy the hunger for wealth. For Columbus, the vision remained clear. This was the gateway to Asia, and these struggles were only the first steps toward greater triumphs. Life at La Isabela soon revealed the harsh realities of building a European colony in unfamiliar lands. The settlers, many of whom had joined the expedition with dreams of quick wealth, grew restless and discontented when gold did not flow as easily as promised. Farming in the tropical soil was different from what they knew in Spain, and supplies from Europe were scarce and often spoiled. Hunger, sickness, and frustration spread quickly, and Columbus found himself not only an explorer, but also a governor responsible for hundreds of lives. He tried to maintain order through strict discipline, sometimes punishing men who disobeyed or deserted their tasks. Yet his authority was questioned, for many of the settlers were not trained sailors but adventurers, nobles, and soldiers unused to hardship. They resented taking orders from a foreign-born admiral and whispered complaints behind his back. Meanwhile, relations with the Taino grew increasingly strained. At first, the islanders had offered food and support, but the growing demands of the Spaniards, combined with misunderstandings and abuses, created resentment. Skirmishes broke out, and Columbus was forced to organize military patrols to defend the settlement. The fragile peace that had existed during his first voyage was beginning to collapse. Despite the troubles, Columbus continued to believe that gold was the key to Spain's interest in the new lands. He sent expeditions into the mountains of Hispaniola, where streams carried flakes of the precious metal. Though the findings were modest, he reported them as proof of greater riches yet to be discovered. His letters to Ferdinand and Isabella emphasized the potential for wealth and for spreading Christianity, even as he downplayed the daily struggles of the colony. In 1494, Columbus embarked on a journey to explore more of the Caribbean. He sailed to Jamaica and Cuba, convinced that these large islands might be part of the Asian mainland. He described Cuba as so vast that it must be a continent, and he ordered his crew to swear an oath declaring it part of Asia. His conviction remained unshaken, even though the landscapes and peoples bore little resemblance to the Asia described by Marco Polo. Returning to Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony in deeper trouble. La Isabela was plagued by disease, famine, and conflict. Some settlers openly defied him, while others wrote letters of complaint to Spain. Yet Columbus pressed on, determined to prove his worth. He established a system of tribute, demanding that the Taino provide gold or cotton to the Spaniards. This policy, harsh and difficult, created resentment and resistance among the islanders. For Columbus, however, it was a necessary measure to demonstrate to the crown that his mission was yielding results. The dream of easy riches was fading, but his belief in the larger vision, reaching Asia by sailing west, remained strong. By 1495, the colony on Hispaniola had become both a symbol of Spain's ambition and a source of constant struggle. Columbus, faced with mounting difficulties, organised expeditions deeper into the island's interior in search of gold. Reports of small deposits fueled his determination, and he believed that with persistence larger sources would soon be uncovered. He sent men to pan rivers, dig in hills, and collect whatever fragments they could find. These modest discoveries were sent back to Spain, along with glowing descriptions meant to maintain the crown's support. Yet beneath the hopeful words, the reality was far more challenging. The settlers remained unhappy, burdened by labour and poor living conditions. Food shortages persisted, and outbreaks of disease weakened both morale and strength. Many questioned whether the hardships were worth the uncertain rewards. Columbus, however, pressed forward with a sense of destiny. He saw himself not just as a governor, but as an instrument of divine will, chosen to open new lands for Christianity in Spain. To maintain control, he relied on both discipline and persuasion. Some settlers were punished harshly for rebellion, while others were rewarded with privileges. He granted land and labour rights to a few loyal men, a practice that foreshadowed the encomienda system, where settlers demanded tribute and work from the local population. Relations with the Taino deteriorated further. Once generous and curious, they now faced increasing demands for food, labour and gold. Resistance grew, and clashes became more violent. Columbus organised armed expeditions to suppress opposition, often with devastating results for the islanders. What had begun as a hopeful exchange between cultures was transforming into conflict and control. Despite the tensions, Columbus's mind remained fixed on exploration. He was convinced that the islands he had found were only stepping stones to the mainland of Asia. Each voyage around the Caribbean seemed to him a step closer to confirming this belief. He explored the coasts of Cuba and Jamaica, charting their shores and naming their bays. He imagined great cities just beyond the horizon, waiting to be reached. News of the difficulties in Hispaniola eventually reached Spain, where critics began to question Columbus's leadership. Some accused him of exaggerating his discoveries, while others complained of mistreatment and poor governance. Yet Ferdinand and Isabella, still eager to secure their claim in the New World, continued to support him, though with growing caution. They sent more supplies, settlers and officials to assist, but also to observe. Columbus, aware of the scrutiny, sought to strengthen his position by sending ships back with gold, cotton, and even enslaved Taino, whom he presented as proof of Spain's dominion. His letters emphasized the opportunities ahead, urging patience and further investment. The dream of vast riches and new lands kept the monarchs intrigued, even as doubts about his methods grew. By the late 1490s, Columbus found himself at a crossroads. He had achieved what no European before him had managed, crossing the Atlantic and establishing Spain's presence in new lands. Yet the reality of governing was far more difficult than he had ever imagined. The settlers at La Isabela remained restless, disappointed that the vast riches they expected were not easily found. Many had envisioned rivers of gold and streets lined with treasures, but instead they faced hunger, labour, and disease. Columbus's authority was challenged not only by discontented colonists, but also by rival officials sent from Spain to oversee the colony. These men carried the crown's orders, but also their own ambitions, and they often clashed with Columbus's decisions. At times, the disputes grew so intense that the settlement seemed on the verge of collapse. Columbus, determined to preserve his position, defended his policies with conviction. He reminded his critics that exploration was never easy, that hardships were natural in new lands, and that patience would eventually yield great rewards. His words, however, did little to calm those who felt betrayed by the gap between promises and reality. Meanwhile, relations with the Taino worsened further. The demands placed upon them, tribute in gold, food or labour, strained their communities. Rebellion flared, and Columbus organised military campaigns to suppress resistance. The Spaniards, armed with steel and horses, held a decisive advantage, and battles often ended in tragedy for the islanders. Columbus justified these measures as necessary to maintain order and to secure Spain's interests, but they deepened the cycle of mistrust and violence. Despite these struggles, Columbus never abandoned his vision of reaching Asia. He believed the islands he had found were close to the mainland of the Indies, and he remained determined to continue westward. In 1496, after several years in the Caribbean, he decided to return to Spain to defend his reputation and secure further support. He sailed back across the Atlantic with a fleet carrying gold, cotton, and enslaved islanders, hoping these would prove the value of his discoveries. His arrival in Spain was far less triumphant than his first. While some still hailed him as a hero, others viewed him with suspicion. Reports of unrest, mistreatment, and disappointment had reached the royal court, and questions about his leadership grew louder. Still, Ferdinand and Isabella recognized the importance of maintaining Spain's claims, and they allowed Columbus to plan another voyage. Though his glory had dimmed, his persistence and sense of destiny convinced the monarchs to give him another chance. Thus, plans began for a third expedition, one that Columbus hoped would finally bring him to the great riches of Asia, or at least prove that his discoveries held the promise he had always believed in. In May of 1498, Columbus embarked on his third voyage, determined to restore his reputation and to strengthen Spain's hold on the new territories. This expedition differed from the previous ones. While earlier voyages had focused on exploring islands, Columbus now set his sights on reaching what he believed would be the mainland of Asia. He departed from Spain with 6 ships, dividing the fleet into 2 groups. 3 vessels carried supplies directly to Hispaniola, where the struggling colony awaited, while Columbus led the other 3 farther south in search of new lands. The journey southward brought him into unfamiliar waters. He sailed along routes closer to the equator, where the heat was stifling and the sea shimmered under a relentless sun. Yet this path also revealed stronger trade winds that carried the ship steadily westward. After weeks at sea, land finally appeared, an island Columbus named Trinidad, for its 3 prominent peaks. He was struck by its beauty, the lush forests, and the abundant fresh water. But even more astonishing lay beyond. Sailing along the Gulf of Paria, Columbus and his men encountered the vast coastline of South America near present-day Venezuela. For the first time, Europeans had reached the mainland of the Americas. Columbus noted the great rivers flowing into the sea, their waters so powerful that they pushed back the salt tides of the ocean. He marvelled at the richness of the land, convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia, perhaps near the legendary realms described by Marco Polo. Though he did not fully grasp the magnitude of his discovery, he sensed he was standing at the threshold of something extraordinary. His health, however, was failing. The long months at sea, the tropical climate, and the strain of leadership weighed heavily on him. By the time he turned north toward Hispaniola, he was weakened and weary. When he arrived at the colony in August 1498, he was met with chaos. The settlement at Santo Domingo, built after La Isabela was abandoned, was torn by rebellion and division. Settlers complained bitterly about hunger, disease, and harsh conditions. Worse still, reports of Columbus's governance had reached Spain, painting him as a poor leader who ruled with excessive severity. His brothers, left in charge during his absence, had struggled to maintain control, and factions within the colony had risen against them. Columbus tried to restore order, but his authority was deeply eroded. The settlers demanded change, and the crown, hearing constant complaints, began to doubt his ability to govern. Yet despite the unrest, Columbus clung to his belief that his discoveries would lead to Asia's wealth. He wrote letters defending himself, appealing to Ferdinand and Isabella for patience and trust. He reminded them of the glory his voyages had already brought Spain, and insisted that greater triumphs still lay ahead. The colony on Hispaniola in 1498 was no longer a place of hope, but one of conflict and division. Many settlers who had come expecting quick fortunes grew bitter when the reality proved otherwise. Hunger, disease, and the relentless labor of survival had drained their spirits. Columbus, weakened by illness, struggled to maintain his authority, but his presence did little to calm the growing discontent. Rumours circulated that he and his brothers were ruling with too heavy a hand, favouring certain groups while punishing others with harsh measures. Some accused him of arrogance, others of cruelty. His insistence on strict discipline and tribute from the Taino only deepened resentment, both among the indigenous people and the settlers themselves. In Spain, complaints reached the royal court with increasing frequency. Letters from disgruntled colonists painted a grim picture: poor governance, lack of riches, and a colony teetering on collapse. The monarchs, though still loyal to Columbus's achievements, could not ignore these voices. They dispatched an investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, with broad powers to examine the situation and to restore order if necessary. When Bobadilla arrived in 1500, he wasted little time asserting his authority. He gathered testimonies from settlers, many of whom were eager to denounce Columbus. Accounts of mismanagement and cruelty filled his records, whether true or exaggerated. For Columbus, it was a devastating blow. Bobadilla ordered his arrest, along with the arrest of his brothers. Shackled in chains, Columbus was placed aboard a ship and sent back to Spain. The image of the admiral of the ocean sea bound like a common criminal shocked even his enemies. During the voyage, Columbus sat in silence, refusing to remove the chains, declaring he would wear them until the monarchs themselves ordered otherwise. Yet his humiliation did not end his determination. When he arrived in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella were moved by his plight. They ordered his release, restored his freedom, and even welcomed him with a degree of honour. Still, they did not return to him the full authority he once held. Others would now oversee the governance of the colonies, leaving Columbus with his titles but diminished power. Despite this setback, Columbus pleaded for another chance to fulfill his mission. He insisted that the lands he had discovered were only the beginning, that the true wealth of Asia was still within reach if Spain would permit him to continue. The monarchs, cautious yet unwilling to dismiss him entirely, eventually granted approval for a fourth voyage. Though his influence was fading, Columbus remained determined to prove himself one final time, convinced that destiny still guided him toward greatness. In 1502, at the age of 51, Columbus set out on what would be his fourth and final voyage across the Atlantic. Though his power had been curtailed and his reputation questioned, he convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to allow one last attempt. His goal remained the same: to find a westward passage to Asia. This time he commanded 4 ships and about 150 men. His sons Diego and Ferdinand did not accompany him, but his brother Bartholomew joined the expedition, offering loyalty and support. The fleet departed from Cadiz in May, sailing once more into the open ocean. Unlike his earlier voyages, this journey did not focus on establishing colonies. Instead, Columbus was determined to push farther, to chart coastlines and to seek the passage he believed lay hidden just beyond the horizon. After weeks at sea, the ships reached the Caribbean once more. They visited Hispaniola briefly, but Columbus was denied entry to the main port, a reminder of how far his influence had fallen. Undeterred, he turned his fleet westward, exploring the coasts of Central America. Between 1502 and 1503, Columbus charted areas of present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. He marvelled at the vast rivers, the dense jungles, and the signs of gold worn by local peoples. To him, every detail hinted that he was near Asia, perhaps close to the fabled lands of the Great Khan. He pressed his men onward, convinced that just beyond the next headland he would find the passage to the Indian Ocean. Yet the journey was marked by hardship. Torrential rains battered the ships, worms bored into the wooden hulls, and food supplies dwindled. Storms drove the fleet onto dangerous reefs, and several vessels were lost. The men, exhausted and frightened, began to question Columbus's judgment. Illness spread, and tensions ran high. In Panama, Columbus believed he had found a narrow strip of land separating the Atlantic from another great sea. If he had been able to cross it, he might have realized the truth of a continent dividing two oceans. But the swamps, resistance from local communities, and the failing health of his men forced him to turn back. The dream of a passage remained unfulfilled. By 1503, disaster struck again when two of his remaining ships became unseaworthy, riddled with leaks. Columbus and his crew limped to the coast of Jamaica, where they were stranded for over a year. Cut off from Spain, surviving on limited supplies, they depended on uneasy relations with the island's inhabitants to survive. Columbus, though ill and weakened, used every ounce of his determination to maintain order. He promised his men that rescue would come, and in 1504, after desperate months, relief finally arrived. He returned to Spain, worn and aged, his dream still unbroken, but his body and influence greatly diminished. When Columbus finally returned to Spain in late 1504, he was no longer the celebrated figure who had once walked into the royal court in triumph. His health was broken from years at sea, his body weakened by fever, arthritis, and the strain of command. He arrived not with treasures or new routes, but with the scars of failure and disappointment. Yet in his heart, he still clung to the conviction that he had reached the edges of Asia, and that his discoveries would one day be recognized for their true worth. The Spain he returned to was different as well. Queen Isabella, who had been his strongest supporter, was gravely ill. By the time Columbus sought an audience, her condition had worsened, and in November 1504 she died. Her death left Ferdinand as sole ruler, and while he respected Columbus, his enthusiasm for the admiral's visions was far less than Isabella's had been. Columbus petitioned the crown to restore his titles and privileges, reminding them of the capitulations of Santa Fe and the promises once made. He argued that his voyages had given Spain lands, riches, and glory, even if the full measure of their wealth was yet to be revealed. His words, though sincere, fell on ears weary of his demands. The crown granted him a pension and recognized his service, but the vast authority he once held was not returned. Columbus spent his final years in relative obscurity, moving between Seville and Valladolid. He wrote letters filled with reflections on his journeys, still insisting that he had reached the Indies and that greater riches lay beyond. At times his writings took on a spiritual tone, describing his role as divinely guided, part of a larger plan to spread Christianity across the world. He remained proud of his achievements, though burdened by the knowledge that others doubted him. In May of 1506, Columbus's health finally gave way. He died in Valladolid on May 20th, surrounded by his sons and a small circle of loyal supporters. The man who had once crossed an ocean to open new horizons passed quietly, without great ceremony. He was buried simply, though his remains would later be moved several times, reflecting the unsettled legacy he left behind. For some, he had been a visionary who dared to sail where others feared. For others, he was a flawed leader whose governance brought suffering. Yet none could deny that he had changed the world. His voyages had begun an era of global connection, trade, and conquest that reshaped history. Columbus himself never knew the full extent of his impact, believing until the end that he had reached Asia rather than a new continent. His story closed in uncertainty, but the waves he had set in motion would roll on for centuries. In the years immediately after Columbus's death, his legacy was uncertain. To some, he remained the admiral of the ocean sea, the man who had crossed the Atlantic and opened the way to lands of unimaginable scope. To others, he was a controversial figure whose governance had failed and whose promises of Asian riches had not been fulfilled. Yet Spain did not turn away from the discoveries he had made. Instead, his voyages sparked a wave of exploration and conquest that spread rapidly across the Atlantic. Other navigators, inspired by his courage, set out to explore the coasts of the new lands. Among them was Amerigo Vespucci, whose accounts of voyages along South America helped Europeans realize that these territories were not Asia, but part of a previously unknown continent. In time, cartographers began using his name, America, to describe the lands Columbus had first reached. This shift in understanding gradually placed Columbus in a different light. While he had believed until his death that he had touched the edges of Asia, later explorers demonstrated that he had in fact revealed a vast new world to Europe. His role became that of a doorway opener, the man who had set in motion the age of discovery. Meanwhile, his family continued to fight for the rights and titles promised to him. His eldest son Diego pursued lengthy legal battles with the crown, known as the Pleitos Colombinos, or the Columbus lawsuits. These cases dragged on for decades, as the crown sought to limit the power and wealth originally granted to Columbus and his heirs. Though Diego and his descendants secured some recognition, the grandeur of the titles promised to the admiral was never fully restored. Across Europe, the story of Columbus stirred imaginations. Writers, scholars, and explorers debated the meaning of his voyages. Some saw him as chosen by Providence, while others criticized his harsh rule in the Caribbean. Yet none could deny that he had changed the maps of the world forever. His journeys connected continents that had long developed in isolation, setting off exchanges of plants, animals, goods, and ideas. Over time, these exchanges would reshape diets, economies, and societies on both sides of the Atlantic. In this way, even though Columbus's own life ended in disappointment, the consequences of his voyages grew larger than anything he could have foreseen. The admiral had sailed west seeking Asia, but what he found was far more profound, the beginning of a new chapter in human history. As decades passed after Columbus's death, his image shifted again and again, shaped by the needs and ambitions of those who spoke his name. In Spain, he was remembered as the man whose voyage had secured the crown's claim to lands of enormous wealth. The gold, silver, and resources flowing from the Americas transformed Spain into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Though Columbus himself had not delivered the endless riches he promised, his daring voyage opened the door for others who did. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro would later march across empires in Mexico and Peru, sending treasure ships back across the Atlantic. In these victories, Spain often recalled Columbus as the first spark of empire. Elsewhere in Europe, reactions varied. In Portugal, some saw him as a rival, whose discoveries had forced them to defend their own explorations in Africa and Asia. In Italy, his birthplace of Genoa claimed him as one of their own, though Columbus had long served the Spanish crown. And in other nations, his voyages were studied with curiosity, offering inspiration for English, French, and Dutch explorers who would one day cross the Atlantic themselves. The Americas, once hidden from European maps, now occupied centre stage. The Columbian Exchange, as it would later be called, reshaped both worlds. From Europe came horses, cattle, wheat, and iron tools. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco. Diseases also crossed the ocean, devastating indigenous populations, while new opportunities and challenges spread across continents. Columbus had not lived to see this transformation, yet his voyages were its beginning. Within Spain itself, debate continued over his legacy. Some praised his courage, his faith, and his persistence in the face of doubt. Others criticized his governance, his harsh policies, and his failure to find the direct route to Asia. The lawsuits of his heirs kept his name alive in courtrooms, while chroniclers wrote both in his favour and against him. Still, for ordinary people, the simple story endured. A sailor had dared to sail west into the unknown, and had returned with proof of lands beyond the horizon. That story, told and retold, grew into legend. By the mid-16th century, Columbus's voyages were woven into the fabric of European history, symbols of both daring adventure and the dawn of empire. He was remembered not only as a navigator, but as a man who had changed how people saw the world. His compass had pointed west, and in following it, he had drawn continents together. As the 16th century unfolded, the figure of Columbus became increasingly symbolic. To the Spanish crown, his daring voyage represented the moment when Spain stepped onto the world stage as a global power. The colonies that grew from his initial discoveries poured wealth into the royal treasury. Silver mines in Mexico and Peru, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and countless new resources flowed back across the Atlantic, enriching the empire. Though Columbus himself had not commanded these later conquests, his first voyage was remembered as the spark that lit the flame. Chroniclers wrote detailed accounts of his journeys, often portraying him as a visionary chosen by divine will. Some compared him to biblical figures, guided by God to spread Christianity to distant lands. Others emphasized his courage against doubt and adversity. These writings helped shape an almost heroic image, one that overshadowed the controversies of his rule in Hispaniola. Meanwhile, the wider consequences of his voyages began to reshape both Europe and the Americas in profound ways. In Europe, diets changed as crops from the New World became staples. Potatoes and maize spread across the continent, eventually sustaining millions. In the Americas, however, the arrival of Europeans brought devastating diseases, social upheaval, and conquest that forever altered indigenous societies. Columbus, though not directly responsible for all that followed, remained the figure at the beginning of it all. His name was invoked in both praise and blame, depending on perspective. In Spain, statues and ceremonies honoured his memory. In Italy, he became a source of pride, a reminder that a son of Genoa had altered world history. Across other European nations, he was studied as a model of boldness, a man who had dared to test the boundaries of the known world. Yet even then, some voices raised questions. Critics pointed out that he had never truly reached Asia, and that his governance in Hispaniola had been marked by failure and cruelty. Still, these criticisms were often quiet compared to the louder celebrations of empire. For most Europeans of the 16th century, Columbus was remembered above all as the admiral who had crossed an ocean and returned alive, proving the world larger and more connected than anyone had imagined. His story became a tale told to inspire sailors, merchants, and scholars, a reminder that the horizon was not the end but the beginning. As generations passed, the memory of Columbus was shaped less by those who had known him, and more by the stories told in books, sermons, and chronicles. Writers of the late 16th and 17th centuries often turned him into a larger-than-life figure, emphasizing his courage, persistence, and divine mission. To many Europeans, he was no longer simply an admiral or a governor, but a symbol of human daring and faith. His image fit perfectly into an age when exploration and conquest were celebrated as triumphs of civilization. At the same time, the practical consequences of his voyages grew clearer. The Columbian Exchange, though not called by that name until centuries later, was transforming the world. Europe's populations grew as new crops enriched diets. In contrast, the indigenous peoples of the Americas faced population collapse as disease, war, and exploitation spread. Columbus himself had not lived to see these vast outcomes, but his voyages had set the stage for them. His role became both celebrated and questioned, depending on whose voice was heard. In Spain, his name was wrapped in honour. Ceremonies marked anniversaries of his voyage, and his family continued to fight for recognition and privileges. In Italy, scholars proudly reminded others that Columbus had been a Genoese sailor, proof that Italians too had shaped world history. Across northern Europe, explorers studied his routes, seeing in them both inspiration and warning. England, France, and the Netherlands, late to overseas expansion, traced their first ambitions back to the wake of Columbus's journey. By the 17th century, however, his reputation began to fade into the background of larger events. The conquests of Cortes and Pizarro, the establishment of great colonies, and the flood of silver and gold from the Americas took centre stage. Columbus was still remembered, but more as the opening chapter of a larger story than as its hero. Yet his legend never disappeared. Poets invoked his name when speaking of bravery. Priests cited him as an example of faith guiding human endeavour. Mapmakers placed his ships on the edges of their charts, reminders of the first voyage that crossed the Atlantic. In these ways, his story endured, passed from one generation to the next, even as criticism lingered in some corners about his failures in governance, about the hardships he imposed on both settlers and islanders. The myth of Columbus, the discoverer, grew stronger. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, he was a figure both historical and legendary, standing at the boundary between fact and symbol. The admiral from Genoa, once doubted and chained, was remembered above all as the man who dared to sail west, and in doing so changed the course of history. During the 18th century, the image of Columbus underwent another transformation. This was the Age of Enlightenment, when philosophers and historians sought to explain the world through reason, science, and the study of human progress. In this new intellectual climate, Columbus was often celebrated not just as a sailor, but as a symbol of curiosity and courage. Writers praised him for daring to test the limits of geography, for proving that knowledge could overcome fear, and for connecting distant parts of the earth. To Enlightenment thinkers, he represented the triumph of human will and reason against superstition. Books and essays circulated across Europe, describing his voyage as one of the greatest turning points in history. Artists painted scenes of Columbus standing proudly on the shores of the New World, often idealized and far from reality. In these images, he was depicted as calm, noble, and visionary, leading his men with confidence. The hardships, conflicts, and controversies of his governance were quietly pushed aside, replaced by a portrait of heroism that fit the ideals of the time. Yet even as his reputation grew, some critical voices began to emerge more clearly. A few historians noted that Columbus had not actually reached Asia, and that his belief in doing so remained a mistake until his death. Others pointed out the suffering of indigenous peoples, raising early moral questions about conquest and colonization. These criticisms, however, were often overshadowed by the larger narrative of discovery and progress. In the Americas themselves, Columbus's name began to hold new meaning. As colonies expanded and new societies formed, his voyage was remembered as the first link between Europe and the lands that would one day become nations of their own. His image was woven into sermons, ceremonies, and the cultural memory of settlers. Ships were named for him, and his story was taught to children as a tale of bravery. By the late 18th century, as revolution stirred in the Americas, Columbus became an even more powerful symbol. In North America, leaders seeking independence from Britain invoked his name to emphasize a new identity separate from the old world. They saw in him a figure who had crossed an ocean to begin something new, an explorer who stood at the birth of their history. Thus Columbus, long a servant of Spain, became a figure adopted by others for their own purposes. His legend continued to evolve, growing larger than the man himself, as generations shaped him into the hero they needed. By the dawn of the 19th century, Columbus's image had taken on an almost mythic quality. No longer remembered only as a navigator who had crossed an ocean, he was celebrated as a founding figure of a new age. In Europe, his name was linked to the rise of empire and global commerce. In the Americas, both North and South, he became a symbol of beginnings, invoked by those who sought to define new nations and identities. The United States, in particular, embraced Columbus as part of its cultural narrative. After winning independence from Britain, Americans searched for heroes who could represent the spirit of discovery and renewal. Columbus, though a servant of Spain, seemed to embody the qualities they admired: boldness, vision, and the courage to step into the unknown. In 1792, on the 300th anniversary of his first voyage, celebrations were held in American cities, praising him as a figure who had opened the path to a new world where freedom could take root. Writers, poets, and educators placed him alongside the founders of the United States, weaving his story into the larger fabric of American identity. Towns, rivers, and even the capital city of the nation took his name, Columbia, turning him into a symbol of the country itself. Across Latin America, where revolutions against Spanish rule unfolded in the early 19th century, Columbus was remembered in more complex ways. Some saw him as the beginning of Spanish oppression, while others honoured him as the one who had revealed their lands to history. Leaders of independence movements sometimes invoked his story as part of their struggle, presenting him as a man who had broken boundaries, much as they sought to do. In Europe, meanwhile, Romantic writers celebrated him as a lonely dreamer, misunderstood by his contemporaries but vindicated by destiny. Plays, poems and novels turned his life into a drama of perseverance against doubt, portraying him as a man chosen by fate to alter the course of history. These works often ignored the harsh realities of his governance, focusing instead on the voyage itself as a symbol of courage. Monuments began to rise in his honour, from Spain to Italy to the Americas. Statues depicted him pointing westward, gazing toward the horizon, forever frozen in the moment of discovery. In these images, he was not the weary and embattled governor of Hispaniola, but the eternal explorer, standing at the threshold of a new world. The 19th century's fascination with progress and destiny made Columbus a perfect figure to celebrate. He became less a man of flesh and blood and more a legend, moulded by each generation to reflect its hopes, ideals, and struggles. As the 19th century advanced, Columbus's legacy grew ever more prominent in both Europe and the Americas. His name was invoked in speeches, carved into monuments, and taught in schools as the story of the man who had discovered a new world. In the United States, his legend became especially powerful. The young nation, seeking a cultural identity distinct from Europe, embraced him as a symbolic ancestor. Though he had sailed for Spain, Americans viewed him as a man who embodied qualities they admired: independence, courage, and vision. The figure of Columbia emerged, a poetic personification of the nation, appearing in art, literature, and patriotic songs. Columbus was woven into the mythology of the United States, standing alongside George Washington as a fatherly figure of origins. Across Latin America, his image was more complex but no less important. Nations that had fought for independence from Spain sought heroes who could connect them to a broader historical narrative. While some viewed Columbus as the starting point of centuries of conquest and exploitation, others honoured him as the one who had revealed their lands to the wider world. Statues and cities carried his name, a reflection of his enduring symbolic power, even in lands where the consequences of colonization were deeply felt. In Europe, the Romantic movement of the 19th century cast Columbus as a solitary genius, misunderstood and unappreciated in his lifetime, yet vindicated by destiny. Writers and poets turned him into a tragic hero, comparing his struggle to those of great artists and visionaries. Paintings depicted him in dramatic scenes, standing before skeptical monarchs, gazing westward from the deck of his ship, or kneeling in prayer upon reaching shore. These artistic works emphasized faith, courage, and perseverance, while quietly ignoring the harsher truths of his governance in the Caribbean. The 400th anniversary of his first voyage in 1892 became a moment of global commemoration. In Spain, Italy, and the Americas, ceremonies and expositions celebrated Columbus as a world-changing figure. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 was one of the largest fairs ever held, showcasing not only Columbus's story, but also the progress of modern industry, science, and culture. Millions attended, linking his voyage to the spirit of discovery that continued to shape the modern world. Yet even during these celebrations, voices of criticism began to grow louder. Some writers and activists pointed out the suffering of indigenous peoples, reminding audiences that the arrival of Columbus had also meant the beginning of conquest, disease, and displacement. These critiques were still in the minority, but they signalled a shift in how future generations might view him. Still, by the end of the 19th century, Columbus stood firmly in the pantheon of world heroes. His story, shaped and reshaped over centuries, had become less about the man himself and more about what he symbolized: the courage to cross unknown seas, the determination to follow a dream, and the power of discovery to change the course of history. As the 20th century began, Columbus's place in history seemed secure. In classrooms across Europe and the Americas, his name was taught as the man who had discovered a new world. Monuments erected in the previous century stood tall in city squares, while his voyages were celebrated in parades, festivals, and textbooks. For many, he symbolized exploration itself, a figure whose courage had bridged the gap between two worlds. In the United States, Columbus Day became an official celebration in many states, later declared a federal holiday in 1937. For Italian immigrants especially, Columbus was a source of pride. They saw in him a connection between their heritage and their new homeland, a reminder that an Italian had played a central role in shaping history. Communities built statues and held festivals in his honor, turning him into a cultural hero as well as a historical one. Across Latin America, too, October 12th was marked in different ways, often called Dia de la Raza, or Day of the Race, a recognition of the blending of cultures that began with his arrival. These celebrations highlighted unity and identity, though they carried complex meanings in lands where the memory of colonization still lingered. Meanwhile, scholars continued to write extensively about Columbus. Some works portrayed him as a man of faith, guided by divine purpose. Others emphasized his practical skills as a navigator, his persistence in the face of doubt, and his role as a visionary who changed the course of history. Schoolbooks often simplified his story, presenting him as a flawless hero whose voyages brought progress to the world. Yet beneath the public celebrations, new perspectives began to emerge. Anthropologists and historians started to study more deeply the impact of European arrival on indigenous peoples. They documented the devastating effects of disease, the collapse of societies, and the forced labour that followed. While Columbus himself could not be blamed for everything that happened in the centuries after his voyages, his arrival symbolized the beginning of those transformations. By mid-century, debates about his legacy had grown sharper. Some continued to see him as a hero of exploration, while others began to question the morality of conquest and colonization. These debates did not erase his prominence, but added layers of complexity to his story. In popular culture, he remained a figure of fascination. Novels, plays, and films retold his voyage, often romanticized and dramatized for audiences. He was shown as the bold dreamer who defied skeptics, the man who gazed westward when others clung to the safety of known shores. The reality of his life, his struggles as a governor, his declining health, his disputes with settlers, was often forgotten in favor of the legend. By the time of the mid-20th century, Columbus's image stood at a crossroads, still celebrated widely, yet increasingly scrutinized as scholars and activists sought a fuller truth about what his voyages had meant for both Europe and the Americas. By the late 20th century, the figure of Columbus had become the center of one of history's most intense debates. For centuries, he had been honored as the great discoverer, the daring admiral who opened the door to a new world. Streets, schools, and cities bore his name, and his holiday was celebrated with parades and patriotic pride. Yet as historical studies deepened, and as indigenous voices gained greater recognition, a different perspective began to take shape. Critics argued that to speak of Columbus as a hero was to ignore the suffering that followed in the wake of his voyages. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases that devastated native populations, often wiping out entire communities. Enslavement, forced labour, and violence soon followed, as colonization spread across the Caribbean and the mainland. For many indigenous peoples, Columbus was not the bringer of discovery, but the beginning of a long era of loss. These critiques reshaped the way his legacy was taught and remembered. In the United States, Columbus Day, once a symbol of national pride, became controversial. Some cities and states began to replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day, honouring those who had lived in the Americas long before Columbus's arrival. Across Latin America, too, October 12th was reinterpreted in new ways. In some places, it became a day to celebrate cultural diversity. In others, it served as a reminder of colonial oppression. The image of Columbus shifted from that of a flawless hero to that of a complex figure, both bold explorer and harbinger of conquest. Scholars emphasize that while his voyage was undeniably one of the most significant events in world history, it was also the starting point of immense suffering. This reassessment did not erase his accomplishments, but placed them in a fuller, more balanced context. At the same time, his story continued to inspire fascination. Writers, filmmakers, and educators still told of his daring voyage across an uncharted ocean, of the moment when land was first sighted after weeks of uncertainty, and of the way his journey linked continents that had long been apart. For many, these elements remained symbols of courage and the human spirit of exploration. For others, they could not be separated from the consequences that followed. By the end of the century, Columbus stood as one of history's most contested figures. To some, he was the admiral who changed the map of the world. To others, he was the emblem of conquest. His story had become less about the man himself, and more about what different societies saw reflected in him: heroism, tragedy, or warning. As the 21st century began, Columbus remained one of the most recognized yet most debated figures in history. His name still appeared in textbooks, his statue stood in city squares, and his voyages were taught as milestones of exploration. Yet alongside admiration, there was also growing criticism, fueled by a deeper awareness of the consequences his arrival had brought. Schools began to present a more nuanced picture, teaching students not only about his courage in crossing the Atlantic, but also about the devastation that followed for indigenous peoples. The duality of his legacy, explorer and conqueror, dreamer and oppressor, became central to discussions about him. In the United States, the debate around Columbus Day intensified. Some communities continued to celebrate it with parades, seeing it as a holiday that honoured exploration and Italian heritage. Others replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day, choosing to recognise the resilience and history of those who had lived in the Americas long before 1492. Across Latin America, similar debates unfolded. Nations renamed the holiday, calling it Día de la Diversidad Cultural, Día de la Resistencia, or Día del Encuentro de dos Mundos, each title reflecting a different interpretation of the same moment in history. Statues of Columbus became flashpoints of protest. In some cities they were removed or relocated, while in others they remained, defended as part of cultural heritage. The controversies revealed how deeply his story still mattered, centuries after his death. Scholars continued to analyse his life with fresh perspectives, using new research to understand both the man and the myth surrounding him. They emphasised how his voyages marked the beginning of globalisation, connecting continents and initiating exchanges of goods, ideas, and cultures that shape the modern world. At the same time, they highlighted the suffering of indigenous peoples as an inseparable part of that history. Columbus was not simply a hero or a villain. He was a man of his time, ambitious, flawed, and determined, whose actions carried consequences beyond what he could have imagined. In popular culture, his image also evolved. Films, novels, and documentaries explored his story from multiple angles, sometimes presenting him as the visionary sailor, sometimes as the symbol of colonization. His name remained powerful, capable of inspiring pride or sparking anger, depending on the lens through which it was viewed. In this way, Columbus entered the new century as a mirror reflecting humanity's struggles with its past, both the achievements that expanded horizons and the injustices that scarred generations. Today, more than 5 centuries after his first voyage, Christopher Columbus remains a figure whose story is told and retold in classrooms, museums, films, and debates around the world. His name continues to carry weight, symbolising both the daring of human exploration and the heavy consequences of conquest. In some places he is honoured as the sailor who opened the door to a new age, while in others he is criticised as the harbinger of colonisation and its devastating effects. This duality has made him one of history's most complex legacies. On one hand, Columbus embodied the spirit of curiosity and courage. At a time when many feared the ocean as endless and unknowable, he dared to believe in a path westward and to risk everything to prove it. His voyage of 1492 connected continents that had been separated for millennia, beginning an era of global exchange that reshaped diets, economies, and cultures. The spread of crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes changed how millions lived. The transfer of animals, tools, and ideas transformed societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Without Columbus's crossing, the modern world as we know it would not exist in the same way. On the other hand, his arrival also marked the beginning of upheaval for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Diseases carried by Europeans swept through communities, causing unimaginable loss. Systems of forced labour, conquest, and cultural disruption followed in the wake of colonization. Though Columbus himself did not create all these outcomes, his voyages became the starting point. For this reason, his statues and holidays have often sparked controversy, with some choosing to celebrate him and others to mourn what his arrival represented. Modern historians often stress that Columbus was neither a saint nor a monster, but a man of his time. He was ambitious, determined, and deeply religious, convinced that God had chosen him for his mission. He was also flawed, prone to harshness in governance, and blinded by a mistaken belief that he had reached Asia. His life was filled with triumphs and failures, moments of glory and times of disgrace. Yet despite these contradictions, his place in history is undeniable. Columbus's story endures because it touches on themes universal to humanity. The desire to explore, the courage to face uncertainty, the consequences of ambition, and the ways in which one individual can alter the course of the world. He reminds us that history is never simple. It is a tapestry woven of courage and cruelty, of vision and error. The sailor from Genoa, once doubted and even imprisoned, changed the map forever. His voyages began an age that brought continents together and reshaped human destiny. Today, whether remembered with honour or with criticism, Columbus continues to stand as a figure who forces us to reflect on exploration, power, and the costs of discovery. His life was not the story of a single man alone, but the story of how the world itself entered a new chapter, one still unfolding in our time.